Hello everybody, welcome to Unit 4, and in Unit 4 we're going to cover two body systems. We'll be covering chapters 22 and 23 in your textbook, and chapter 22 will be about the respiratory system. And so let's get started. You may want to go ahead and do the respiratory anatomy in the module on Blackboard first before you start the physiology. There's not all that much anatomy to learn for the respiratory system, but it'll kind of help you get become familiar with the parts before you start learning about respiratory function. Respiratory is a really good system to follow cardiovascular with because, of course, during the cardiovascular system you were learning about how important it is to transport oxygen gas and carbon dioxide to appropriate locations in the body. And of course your respiratory system is playing a big role in partnering with the cardiovascular system to accomplish that. So a good system to follow up the cardiovascular system as we go through our A&P topics here. Alright, so this first video we're just going to introduce some of the concepts here. And as I just mentioned, respiration, this process of gas exchange between the blood and the air in your lungs, involves both the respiratory and the circulatory systems. And on this diagram over here you can see the parts of the respiratory anatomy. And you'll be hearing a lot more about those over on the anatomy side. We'll have some review here in the physiology lectures. There are actually 4 different processes involved with respiration, and again the idea is you've got to take oxygen gas, O2, in from the air and move that oxygen gas into the bloodstream so that your blood can bring oxygen gas to your tissues. Almost all tissues in your body need oxygen gas, and so I'm going to keep emphasizing that here because I teach microbiology as well, and usually students have had biology 201 and 202 when they take microbiology, and I'm always shocked by how many microbiology students are telling me that most parts of the human body don't have oxygen gas, and that's absolutely not true. All of your cells need oxygen gas in order to do cellular respiration, which is the process used by your cells to make ATP. That's the preferred energy molecule for carrying out all of the functions in cells. As you guys know, and as you guys have had preached to you throughout your A&P classes. So it is absolutely not true that most parts of the body don't have oxygen gas. That's the whole purpose, one of the main purposes of your bloodstream is to deliver that oxygen gas all throughout the entire body. And then the other thing that has to happen is that carbon dioxide waste, we see CO2 here, that is a waste that is produced during cellular respiration. As you know, CO2 contains carbon, those carbons are in the organic nutrients like glucose sugars that are broken down to harness energy and make ATP in your cells. So those carbons you see there are coming from the nutrients that you're breaking down, and you got to get rid of those. If those build up, they function, and we'll see more about this in this unit, they function as acids. The more these build up, the more acidic your body fluids become, and that's the key reason why you've got to get rid of CO2 and send it back out into the atmosphere. You can't let this build up in your body. So obviously your respiratory system is going to play a very big role in exchanging O2 and CO2 between the air and the lungs. Alright, so as I mentioned, respiration involves 4 major processes or steps. And now usually when we're talking about respiration, people are thinking about breathing. And the technical name for breathing is pulmonary ventilation. And maybe you've heard of somebody being on a ventilator before because they can't breathe for themselves. So pulmonary refers to the lungs. Ventilation is the act of breathing, and the idea there is you're moving air in and out of your lungs. All right, now down deep within the lungs, inside little microscopic air sacs, you have external respiration. That is the term that refers to the exchange of O2 and CO2 between the air in the lungs and the blood. All those pulmonary capillaries we were learning about during the cardiovascular system, that's where this is taking place. Those pulmonary capillaries are wrapped around these little tiny microscopic air sacs in the lungs, and that's where your gas exchange takes place. That's called external respiration. All right, then our third step is you've got to transport O2 and CO2 through the blood. So transport is an important aspect of these processes. And then you have internal respiration. This is where the O2 moves out of the systemic capillaries and into the tissue fluid so that the cells in those tissues can take up the O2. And the blood has to pick up the CO2 wastes that have been generated by cells due to cellular respiration. That's called internal respiration. So those are our four major steps, and you can see here which ones involve the respiratory system and which ones involve the circulatory system and or the cardiovascular system. And external respiration right in here, if you notice, you've got the red and the blue lines there overlapping because this is where cooperation occurs between the lungs and the cardiovascular system as you have that gas exchange taking place in the lungs. Please note that external respiration, internal respiration have very distinct definitions. They are not the same as cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the process by which nutrients like glucose, sugars are broken down to harness energy to make ATP. And you need O2 for that process, as hopefully you've learned a little bit about before. You need O2 for cellular respiration. It's used in the very last chemical reaction of cellular respiration, and if you don't have it, most of cellular respiration shuts down, and then you can't make your ATP. All right, so I'll quit harping on cellular respiration, at least for a few minutes. Okay, so you will be learning the anatomy over on the anatomy side for the respiratory system. I do want to point out that the respiratory system is divided up into the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. And you're going to hear those terms used fairly frequently because you're going to hear about people having upper respiratory tract infections and lower respiratory tract infections. In general, the dividing line is here, the larynx, where your Adam's apple is located. You know, that's that widened area just superior to the trachea, the main air tube here that's going to bring air down toward the lungs. So that's really the dividing line between the upper and the lower respiratory tracts. You have that little flap, the epiglottis, that when you're swallowing food and water, it's a flap that closes over the top of the larynx so that you don't have food going down into the larynx as you're swallowing it. Because if you do, you're going to choke. So that little flap there is really the dividing line between the upper and the lower respiratory tracts. Now there are some other definitions. Some people say you're not in the lower respiratory tract until you're down in here, actually in the thorax or in the thoracic cavity area. But most other people begin the lower respiratory tract here at the larynx. Your upper respiratory tract is going to consist of your nose and your nasal cavity, your oral cavity, and then the different sections of your pharynx. All of those are parts of the upper respiratory tract. Lower respiratory tract, your larynx, your trachea, your bronchi, which include bigger ones that branch out into smaller ones and extend throughout the lungs. And then also you finally get to these little tiny air sacs in the lungs called alveoli where gas exchange takes place. All of those are going to be parts of your lower respiratory tract. Okay, so that was just a kind of a brief introduction to the respiratory system. In the second lecture, we're going to talk more about what goes on in the upper respiratory tract. Most of the business stuff with the respiratory system is really happening down in the lower respiratory tract. in the lungs, and so we'll spend a lot more time talking about that. But in the second lecture, we are going to talk about some of the features and functions of what's going on up in your upper respiratory tract.